Verisk's Emerging Issues, your source for vital market intelligence on the evolving risks and opportunities facing insurers and risk managers that can help inform product development and strategic planning. Verisk's Emerging Issues.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening in. I'm Catherine Lynch, and I work as a data analyst on the Emerging Issues team here at Verisk. Today, I'm joined by Will Nichols, who is head of climate and resilience at Maplecroft. We're going to be diving into some of his recent work on migration trends and heat risk and discuss how the ESG movement is evolving. Will, thanks for being here. Before we dive into some of these topics, can you describe your role at Maplecroft?
Absolutely. Hi, Catherine. Thanks for having me on. I head up the climate resilience team at Maplecroft. So effectively, I manage a team of experts who help organizations sort of determine the risks they're facing from changes related to climate, from natural capital, as well as how to mitigate those threats and seek out any opportunities arising from those shifts. We also look a great deal at supply chain resilience as well. That's a real big topic for us. And companies are increasingly coming under pressure for investors and regulators to disclose these kind of details. They're being recognised as materially important. So we're getting busier and busier.
That makes sense. And one of these tools you've developed and worked on is the climate risk data set. Can you describe the kind of risk you cover in this database?
So our climate risk data set was expanded last year to include the latest climate model projections. And these allow organizations to really understand how this extensive set of physical climate risks manifest under a range of different future climate scenarios and how those risks evolve over time. So we look at both what we call acute physical risks. So these are things that come on suddenly, like heat waves or precipitation extremes, as well as the slower moving chronic risks, which people might recognize as sea level rise or long-standing changes in temperature or shifts in rainfall patterns as well. So what we've done is we've added multiple time periods. So that ranges from a kind of baseline climate, so effectively a snapshot of now, right the way up to 2080. And we've really enhanced granularity. So clients can really kind of get under the hood and kind of meet, and I guess in some cases exceed these kind of mandatory and voluntary climate disclosure frameworks that they are increasingly being asked to disclose to.
Fantastic. So it sounds like it's really an extensive data set of these risks. And on this topic of climate, earlier in the year, you published some great research that illustrated how many of the fastest growing cities in the US also face some of the greatest heat risk. What did you learn from this research?
Yeah, that's right. And this is a really nice example of how we can use the climate data set to uncover some of these issues by sort of looking at the change over time. And we've also brought in a lot of population data, so you can use this data in conjunction with other data sets as well to really get to the nub of some of these problems. And we chose to focus on heat. And in fact, there's been a lot of focus on heat, not just from us, but from other people as well. And rightly so. It's a bigger killer than floods or hurricanes, which I think a lot of people don't realize. Plus, you have, with rising heat, you've also got these greater impacts on infrastructure, on power networks, and of course on people's health as well. And we wanted to look really at the impacts on cities because obviously that's where a huge chunk of our kind of GDP derives from, and increasingly we are an urbanized world. More people almost live in cities now than live in rural areas. So what was really interesting to us, I guess, was that finding that the kind of among the cities seeing the biggest increase in hot days and mean days exceeding 95 Fahrenheit or 35 Celsius. So among these cities were a number of those that are projected to experience these largest rise in population, and these include pretty well-known cities: Houston, Orlando, San Antonio, Austin. So we kind of looked at that, and we haven't sort of delved in exactly why people are moving to these cities, but we've looked at population projections that show that these cities are increasing. Our theories are that movements are likely to be linked to jobs, to kind of commerce. Plus, increasingly we see an older population looking to retire, and especially in the States, as you'll be aware, people often look to move from colder areas up north to kind of warmer areas in the south as they get a little bit older. So obviously, anytime you get influx of population of people moving places, that puts pressure on existing resources, on infrastructure, whether that's power, whether that's water, whether that's land. But then when you add in the heat impacts as well, we could still see real issues in terms of demand for these kind of resources, in terms of obviously demand for water and heat, power for cooling. Plus, of course, there's the potential negative health outcomes. So this would be particularly pronounced on an elderly population. So heat stress is something that is almost kind of a measure of humidity. That's particularly dangerous for people who are working outdoors a lot, or people who are a little bit older as well. It can bring on all sorts of other kind of health outputs as well. What kind of struck us, I guess, looking at this, is that it's something that perhaps policymakers maybe haven't got such a hold of. Looking at some of the policies that are in place, one of it was triggered by a federal mandate that President Biden was bringing in, that would ensure that there are kind of standards around what people can do in terms of work at certain heat levels. And the reason that was sort of brought in is because a lot of these don't exist at a state level, especially in states where heat levels are particularly high, and those where the heat is predicted to increase as well. There are certain governors who have been recanting these laws, and certain governors where these have been coming in. So it's a bit of a mixed bag across the US at the moment. From our point of view, we would suggest that policymakers really need to kind of recognise these threats. Perhaps they need to start reacting to them a bit quicker. The pace of change with climate change is really picking up. So, reacting to these by perhaps altering building codes, perhaps looking at how planning policy can attenuate the impacts that warmer climates will have. It may also be kind of changes that organizations need to go through, and whether that's looking at concern with outdoor work, and that may be bringing in more protective equipment, it may be more breaks, it could be changing working patterns so that people are actually working at cooler times of the day. In terms of infrastructure, we've seen a lot of infrastructure issues in the south of the US with heat and cold, for that matter. So grids are going to need to be reinforced. It may need to start managing demand. If there are more people in one place and they're all trying to turn their devices on at a certain time, that's going to create kind of spikes that may be difficult to deal with the current kind of aging grid infrastructure. So certainly looking at that, ideally kind of bringing in more renewable energy provision to help us hit the climate targets that we need to hit as well would be useful. And of course, people need to perhaps give more thought as to how an older population will react to these kind of changes. So, not just in terms of putting on additional health support, but also things like cooling areas, making sure public transport is available as well, so people aren't walking long distances in the heat.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It seems, almost counterintuitive that people are flocking to these hotspots, but as you laid out, it really will impact how we need to change our infrastructure and our resources. But as you said, it's not just the resources that will be impacted, by a warming climate. It's also many of these social and economic vulnerabilities, which is another set of emerging risks we are paying attention to here at Verisk. So who is most vulnerable to climate change? And how will a changing climate impact some of these social and economic issues?
It's a great question, because of course this is a global risk. It's not just the US, but the entire world is facing issues around a changing climate, and that's not just from the sort of direct impacts of more frequent and powerful extreme weather events. There's also, as you mentioned, these kind of gradual changes to sea levels and weather patterns and so on. And unfortunately, it's the case that it's very often the people who are most vulnerable to these kind of impacts are those who've contributed the least to climate change. So places like sub-Saharan Africa, really, these are places that are really kind of at the front line. And I guess it's quite an interesting fact around climate change that it sort of shines a light on the global patterns that we already see. And climate's it's a nice indicator of how we're all connected, and we're already seeing how climate change in places like Central America is driving migration to the US border up through Mexico. And this is just sort of one of many examples of how physical threats can snowball into these social, economic, and political risks. So an example we often use is around changing weather patterns, how they can make growing crops in a particular region much more difficult. So then if those crops are more difficult to grow, people might start moving away from the land to the cities or even outside countries' borders. This decreases the agricultural workforce that is currently in place and could potentially reduce production of other crops, creating possible food insecurity and maybe hitting revenues for governments if they're dependent on agricultural exports. Then you have, with people moving to new areas that we mentioned before, there's going to be this extra pressure on resources and infrastructure. And sadly, we know from experience that large movements of people are at risk of human rights abuses like trafficking and other crimes. Large groups of people moving into new areas can create problems there, whether it's sort of unrest. Sometimes you can get protests, and in extreme situations, you can even sort of derail things like government stability. This is a really interesting point for us because we have this data that not only looks at climate but also looks at human rights issues and geopolitical issues and economic issues. And we're starting to see organizations address direct climate risk fairly effectively. Like I said right at the start, that's kind of been our job for the last sort of few years, is looking at how organizations are facing these climate risks and what they're doing about it. But these kind of second order or kind of cascading impacts where it's snowballing into these social, political, economic issues, so much more difficult to plan for. I mean, it's very difficult to budget for that. It's difficult to kind of even envisage. And for governments, it's a huge problem because your vulnerability as a country to climate threats really depends on addressing all these factors. So it's not just the scale of the physical climate threat you're facing, but also these, how strong are your institutions? What are the poverty and wealth levels? How educated is your population? What are the levels of equality? What are the kind of major industries in your economy? If you're very dependent on agriculture, you're much more likely to be affected by climate change. So, addressing these kind of threats really takes a lot of kind of far-sighted vision, both from organizations and from governments, and it's not easy to move the needle, but it is something that we do need to start planning for and addressing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think companies have really started to grapple with some of these things, and that kind of brings us to a discussion of ESG, which stands for a company's environmental, social, and governance impacts. At least in the US, we've seen the tide change on corporate sustainability. After years of ESG adoption, many companies are turning their back on climate pledges or even greenhushing, which is when a company hides or refuses to publish some ESG information. Do you see this move away from ESG continuing, and what could this mean for climate goals in general?
Interesting question. I've been doing this job for almost 10 years now, and we've really seen a sort of a rise and dip in kind of enthusiasm, or several rises and dips in enthusiasm over that time. I mean, especially with ESG, we had this kind of surge of enthusiasm and uptake. But part of the issue around ESG is that it wasn't very well defined. It could mean a lot of different things to different people. It's a little bit like sort of CSR when that started. And so it was very easy to kind of make these pledges, to make these policies for organizations, as it was fairly difficult if you're an investor or a regulator to say one way or the other whether these were actually being fulfilled, or perhaps more importantly, whether actually these are material to the organization. Is it something that's going to impact the organization's kind of value or its strategy or its sustainability going forward? So we've seen kind of investors and regulators push back against that a bit and say, well, hold on, what exactly is it you're doing? And now we're seeing these benchmarks coming forward to look at, to define, exactly what a sustainable activity is, and hopefully provide a comparison and give investors and regulators an idea of what companies are up to. So a great example of this is the EU taxonomy, which asks companies to say exactly how much capex, opex revenues are going towards a set of defined sustainable activities, and that's a lot of work we're doing with clients now is kind of working towards that. And so, I guess as you expect, with now having a kind of higher bar to clear and tougher standards to meet in terms of your claims and your targets, you can kind of see why there might have been a bit of retrenchment among organizations, because they could face fines, they could face legal action if they're found or suspected of not disclosing accurately. We are increasingly working with companies to try and put a a dollar value on the climate risks they face. But the methodologies there are quite new, and some organizations may not want to disclose numbers that could be misinterpreted and potentially impact their value. So an understanding of that data, until that becomes sort of more widespread, and it will, we would expect then at that point ESG to really kind of bounce back and become an integral part of how a business is valued. And certainly at the same time with climate goals, I would expect something similar. And I think climate is a little different to sort of broader ESG, just because climate goals are a little easier to measure. Typically, you can measure emissions, you can measure the percentage of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that's stuff you can really, it's a metric, you can hold it, you can say this is what we're doing, this is what we've done. And in fact, some companies have worked backwards from sort of where we as a planet need to be in terms of our emissions, and worked out exactly what their sector can emit at that point and what they can emit at that point. And these are partly in line with things like science-based targets. So I think personally that the climate side of things is still going. I think that's because it is better defined. It's more easy to get a handle on. I think with ESG, as I said, it's a little bit slippier at the minute. So once we've got a bit more of a idea of exactly what that means, what we consider to be ESG, and then most importantly, how this is of value to a business, because that's the key thing. We don't want businesses necessarily to be doing stuff that isn't of value to them or isn't material to them. Once that's been kind of proven on a higher scale, we're going to see a bit more of that, despite what may be happening in kind of politics. Whichever kind of government we have across the world, this makes good business sense because it's about ultimately sustaining your company in the long term. So I would expect once we have that kind of definition, we're going to see much more of a return to ESG. It may not be called ESG, but I think effectively it'll be the same kind of thing.
That makes sense. And another component of this is, as companies have begun to measure and publicize their impact, at least on the emerging issues team here at Verisk, we've seen that sometimes that can be a risk for companies. Some companies, both in and outside the US, have been accused of greenwashing and sued for fraudulent ESG claims. Is this a growing problem or risk for companies?
As I said earlier, I think there are some kind of valid reasons why companies could be a bit wary of disclosures, and potential legal and regulatory risks are certainly among those. We've had a lot of regulations in Europe, and there's real kind of pushback on the burden that that's imposing on companies. In the near term, we may be kind of regulated out, and we may have this kind of reticence to disclose, as we kind of mentioned. But I think over the medium and longer term, as companies get to grips with what these regulations actually mean, both in terms of what they have to disclose, but also in terms of the internal resources they need to put towards this. So, do they need new teams, or can they actually use a lot of these work streams that are already ongoing to kind of meet these disclosures? So a lot of the regulations, especially around climate and nature, have been designed that they interlink with already existing standards, with the idea being that people don't have to go out and do something completely new. It should be that it's a kind of extension of a work stream you're already going. Once we have that clarification around ESG, once we have a kind of clearer idea among companies of what this actually entails, what good looks like, what just okay looks like, because some companies, they want to be leading, some companies, they want to be kind of more around the pack. It's absolutely fine. That makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. So once we've got that kind of idea of what that involves and what resources we've got to put towards that, I think we'll see less risk around greenwashing, less issues around kind of fraud and ESG claims. I mean, that's partly what these regulations are trying to do to try and stop people putting these kind of things into the world. I'm sure we'll see people being a little reticent about putting stuff out for the next few years. But as I say, I think, if companies are getting kind of good advice on their disclosures, they're using data to make sure the kind of most material issues are being identified and addressed, then for them, hopefully, there shouldn't be too much to worry about in terms of their disclosures.
That makes sense. Will, thanks so much for being here and sharing your knowledge. For more information on climate and ESG risk, please visit the Emerging Issues website and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Verisk's Emerging Issues, your source for vital market intelligence on the evolving risks and opportunities facing insurers and risk managers that can help inform product development and strategic planning. Verisk's Emerging Issues.